6 weeks ago, I was dodging traffic as a bike messenger in San Francisco. Now I dodge zombies. When the outbreak hit, everyone else got trapped in cars and buildings. I had something they didn't: a bike and knowledge of every shortcut in the city. While others died, I became the lifeline connecting scattered survivors across the dead streets. My daily deliveries now carry more than packages, they carry hope. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Rivera, but everyone calls me Jax, and I'm probably the last bike messenger in San Francisco. 6 weeks ago, I thought the worst part of my job was dodging angry taxi drivers and avoiding getting doored by careless passengers climbing out of Ubers. Now I dodge the undead, and those taxi drivers seem like a pleasant memory from another lifetime. Before the world went to hell, I had what you might call the perfect job for someone who thrived on chaos. I was a premium bike messenger for Morrison and Associates, one of those high-end law firms downtown that charged clients $500 an hour just to have their lawyers breathe in the same room as legal documents. My job was simple: get sensitive packages and documents from point A to point B faster than anyone else in the city, no matter what stood in my way. But that was just my day job. When the sun went down and the business suits disappeared into their climate-controlled cars, I became someone else entirely. In the underground racing circuit that operated in the shadows of San Francisco's hills and alleyways, I was known as El Fantasma, the Ghost. I earned that nickname because I could appear and disappear through the city's maze of streets faster than anyone thought possible. While other racers stuck to the obvious routes, I knew every shortcut, every alley, every loading dock that could shave precious seconds off a run. I grew up in the Mission District, where my father ran a small auto repair shop, and my mother worked as a seamstress for one of those fancy boutiques in Union Square. They immigrated from Guadalajara before I was born, carrying nothing but hope and an unshakable belief that hard work could build a better life. My father taught me that anything mechanical could be fixed if you understood how it worked and weren't afraid to get your hands dirty. My mother taught me that reputation was everything, that people would judge you not by what you said, but by what you delivered. Those lessons shaped how I approached both my legitimate work and my nighttime racing. I became obsessed with knowing every inch of San Francisco's streets, not just the main arteries that everyone used, but the hidden veins that only locals knew existed. I memorized which alleys stayed clear during rush hour, which loading docks were unguarded after business hours, and which rooftop connections could turn a 20-minute ride into a 5-minute sprint. My racing bike was a work of art, a custom-built fixed-gear machine that I'd modified over years of tinkering. Every component was chosen for maximum efficiency and minimum weight. The frame was steel, not carbon fiber, because steel could take a beating and keep rolling. I'd learned that lesson the hard way during my first underground race when I crashed into a parked delivery truck and walked away with nothing but scrapes while riders on expensive carbon bikes were calling their insurance companies. The messenger bag I carried was more than just equipment. It was my mobile office. Inside, I kept not just the obvious tools like tire irons and patch kits, but also things that most people would consider paranoid. I had emergency cash stashed in a hidden compartment, protein bars that wouldn't spoil, a basic first aid kit, and a multi-tool that could handle almost any mechanical problem. My racing buddies used to tease me about being prepared for the apocalypse. Turns out they weren't far wrong. I also kept a modified two-way radio clipped to my messenger bag strap. Officially, it was for communicating with the dispatch office at Morrison and Associates. Unofficially, it could pick up police frequencies, emergency services, and the underground racing community's coded communications. Information was power in my world, and knowing what was happening before everyone else gave me the edge that kept me employed and kept me winning races. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in October. My alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning, same as always. I rolled out of bed in my studio apartment on 24th Street, just a few blocks from where I grew up. The apartment wasn't much, barely 400 square feet, with a Murphy bed and a kitchenette that consisted of a hot plate and a mini fridge. But it was mine, and more importantly, it was on the ground floor with direct access to the street. When you make your living on a bike, being able to roll out your front door and onto the pavement in 30 seconds can mean the difference between landing a premium delivery contract and watching it go to someone else. I went through my morning routine with the mechanical precision that came from years of practice. Check the weather app overcast with possible rain later, which meant I'd need to account for slippery streets and reduced visibility. Check the news, nothing unusual, just the typical San Francisco complaints about housing costs and traffic. Check my bike tire pressure, brake tension, chain lubrication, everything that could mean the difference between a smooth day and a catastrophic mechanical failure. That morning, as I loaded my messenger bag with the usual supplies, something made me double-check my emergency stash. I pulled out the hidden compartment and counted the cash, $300 in 20s and 10s, enough to handle any crisis that couldn't be solved with a credit card. I restocked the protein bars, checked the expiration date on my first aid supplies, and made sure my multi-tool was sharp and functional. Looking back now, I can't explain what prompted that extra attention to detail. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe some part of my brain was already picking up on signals that my conscious mind hadn't processed yet. The first thing I noticed when I stepped outside was the sirens. San Francisco always had sirens: police, fire, ambulance. It was part of the urban soundtrack that you learned to tune out after a while. But that morning was different. There were too many of them, all heading in the same direction toward downtown, and they had an urgency that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'd heard enough emergency vehicles over the years to recognize the difference between a routine response and something major. I clipped my radio to my bag strap and tuned it to the emergency frequencies as I unlocked my bike from the reinforced chain that kept it secure overnight. The chatter was more frantic than usual, with references to multiple incidents and requests for backup that seemed to be going unanswered. The dispatchers' voices had that tight, controlled tone that emergency personnel use when they're trying to stay professional while dealing with something that's spinning out of control. As I started pedaling toward downtown, I noticed other details that didn't fit the normal pattern of a Tuesday morning. The streets were emptier than they should have been for 7 o'clock rush hour. The few people I saw walking seemed to be moving with unusual urgency, not the leisurely pace of commuters grabbing coffee before settling into their office routines. Several shops that should have been opening for business had their security gates still pulled down, and I could see faces pressed against windows, looking out at the street with expressions I couldn't quite read from a distance. My first pickup of the day was at Morrison and Associates on Montgomery Street in the financial district. It was a routine job, picking up a contract that needed to be delivered to a client's office in Soma before 9 o'clock. The kind of simple, high-paying delivery that kept the lights on and the rent paid. I'd made the same run dozens of times before, and I could navigate from my apartment to their office building blindfolded. But as I got closer to downtown, the wrongness in the air became more pronounced. The usual morning traffic was lighter than normal, but the vehicles I did see were moving erratically. I watched a taxi run a red light at the intersection of Market and Van Ness, something that would normally result in an immediate ticket from the SFPD officers who worked that corner during rush hour. But there were no officers visible, just an empty intersection with traffic flowing according to whatever random impulses drove each individual driver. The radio chatter was getting more intense, with references to incidents at multiple hospitals and requests for hazmat teams that weren't making sense in context. I heard mentions of water department facilities and something about contamination, but the communications were too fragmented and coded for me to piece together a complete picture. All I knew was that something was happening, something big enough to strain the city's emergency response system. I locked my bike to the rack outside the Morrison and Associates building and took the elevator to the 15th floor, same as always. The lobby was quieter than usual, no security guard at the front desk, no cleaning crew finishing up their overnight shift. The elevator itself felt different somehow, like the building was holding its breath. When the elevator doors opened on the 15th floor, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Morrison and Associates was normally a hive of activity by 7:30 in the morning, with paralegals rushing to prepare documents for court filings and associates frantically researching precedents for cases that were going to trial. But that morning, the office felt abandoned. Mrs. Chen wasn't at her usual post behind the reception desk. Alina Chen had worked for Morrison and Associates for 15 years, and in all the time I'd been making deliveries to their office, I'd never seen her desk empty during business hours. She was one of those people who seemed to live at the office, arriving before dawn and staying until well after the partners had gone home to their families in Pacific Heights. Her absence was like finding a clock that had stopped ticking, technically possible, but fundamentally wrong. I walked past her empty desk toward the elevator bank, planning to take the stairs to the document preparation office on the 16th floor where my pickup would be waiting. But as I passed the elevator, I noticed that the call buttons were dark and unresponsive. A handwritten sign taped to the doors read, "Out of order use stairs." That wasn't unusual in itself. Old buildings had mechanical problems all the time. But combined with everything else I'd observed that morning, it felt like another piece of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. The stairwell was dimmer than the main office areas, lit only by emergency lighting that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. As I climbed toward the 16th floor, I could hear sounds coming from above, voices, but not the kind of professional conversation you'd expect in a law office. These voices were strained, almost panicked, with an edge that made me slow my pace and listen more carefully. I reached the 15th floor landing and paused, trying to identify what I was hearing. There were definitely people talking, but the words were unclear, muffled by the thick fire doors that separated the stairwell from the office spaces. What I could make out sounded like argument or distress, the kind of heated discussion that happens when something has gone seriously wrong. My messenger training kicked in. When you're carrying sensitive documents worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, you learn to be cautious about walking into situations you don't understand. I pulled out my phone to call the Morrison and Associates main number, thinking I could get someone to explain what was happening before I proceeded with my pickup. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. That was unprecedented. Morrison and Associates was the kind of firm that prided itself on being available to clients 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Someone should have answered by the second ring, if not Mrs. Chen, then one of the night shift paralegals who handled urgent filings. I tried calling again, with the same result. The phone just rang into an empty void, as if the entire office had simply vanished. But I could still hear voices from the floors above, so I knew people were in the building. Something was wrong, but I couldn't identify what or how wrong. That's when I heard the scream. It came from somewhere above me in the stairwell, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard in a professional office building. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect from someone who had received bad news or was dealing with a stressful deadline. This was primal, full of terror and pain, the kind of sound that bypasses your rational mind and goes straight to the part of your brain that's been keeping humans alive for thousands of years. The scream was followed by other sounds: running footsteps, doors slamming, more voices raised in what was definitely panic now. Whatever was happening upstairs, it was escalating rapidly, and my instincts were telling me to get out of the building immediately. But I'm a professional, and Morrison and Associates was one of my best clients. I'd built my reputation on reliability, on being the messenger who could handle any situation and still deliver packages on time. Walking away without at least attempting to complete my pickup felt like betraying everything I'd worked to build. I decided to compromise. Instead of going up to the 16th floor where my pickup was supposed to be waiting, I'd go back down to the 15th floor and try to find someone who could explain what was happening. If Mrs. Chen was dealing with some kind of office emergency, maybe I could help, or at least get enough information to decide whether I should reschedule the pickup for later in the day. I opened the fire door to the 15th floor and stepped back into the Morrison and Associates office space. The silence was even more pronounced now, broken only by the humming of air conditioning and the distant sounds of whatever chaos was unfolding on the floors above. The reception area was still empty, Mrs. Chen's desk still abandoned with her computer screen, displaying a screensaver of her grandchildren playing in Golden Gate Park. I walked deeper into the office, past cubicles filled with the detritus of interrupted work, half-empty coffee cups, legal documents spread across desks, computer screens still glowing with partially completed briefs. It looked like everyone had simply vanished in the middle of their morning routine, as if some cosmic force had reached down and plucked every human being out of the building, while leaving everything else untouched. That's when I heard something that made my blood freeze, a wet, tearing sound coming from the break room at the far end of the office. It was organic, wrong, like the sound a butcher makes when separating meat from bone, combined with a low, rhythmic moaning that barely sounded human. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around and leave immediately. But curiosity and professional obligation are powerful forces, and I found myself walking toward the break room despite the warnings my subconscious was broadcasting. I told myself that someone might be injured, that whatever emergency was happening might require immediate medical attention that I could provide with my basic first aid training. I approached the break room slowly, my footsteps muffled by the carpet that covered the office floors. The sounds were getting louder and more distinct, definitely someone eating, but eating in a way that sounded savage and uncontrolled. As I got closer, I could smell something metallic and organic, like the scent that hangs in the air around my father's auto shop when he's working on a car that's been in a serious accident. I reached the break room doorway and looked inside, and what I saw there changed my understanding of reality forever. Mrs. Chen was there, but she wasn't Mrs. Chen anymore. She was crouched over someone in a business suit, someone who wasn't moving, someone who would never move again. Her normally immaculate gray hair was matted with dark stains, and her professional blouse was torn and soaked with something that was definitely not coffee. But it was her face that broke my mind. Her eyes were clouded white like milk, and her mouth was working with mechanical persistence, tearing at flesh with teeth that seemed sharper than they should have been. When she heard my footsteps, she looked up at me, and the sound that came out of her throat was nothing that could ever be called human. It was a shriek of hunger and rage, a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight to the primitive part of my brain that recognizes the presence of a predator. Black blood dripped from her mouth, and in that moment I understood that whatever was happening in San Francisco that morning, it was far worse than any emergency I could have imagined. Mrs. Chen started to rise from her crouch, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by someone who had never seen a human being move before. Her white eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, and I realized that I was no longer looking at a person, but at something that wore a person's face, while harboring an entirely different kind of consciousness underneath. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Every survival instinct that had kept me alive through years of dodging traffic and navigating dangerous neighborhoods kicked in simultaneously. I turned and ran, my messenger bag bouncing against my back as I sprinted toward the stairwell. Behind me, I could hear Mrs. Chen following, but her movements were clumsy and uncoordinated, as if she was still learning how to operate her own body. I hit the stairwell door at full speed and took the stairs 3 at a time, my legs pumping with the same explosive power that had made me a champion in the underground racing circuit. 15 floors had never seemed so far, and with each step I could hear that inhuman shrieking echoing in the stairwell above me, joined now by other voices, other sounds that suggested Mrs. Chen wasn't the only person in the building who had undergone whatever terrible transformation I'd witnessed. When I finally burst through the emergency exit into the lobby, I was moving so fast that I nearly collided with the security desk. The lobby was still empty, but I could see through the floor-to-ceiling windows that faced Montgomery Street, and what I saw there confirmed my worst fears. The street outside was chaos. Cars were abandoned in the middle of traffic lanes, their doors hanging open as if their occupants had simply vanished mid-commute. People were running in every direction, some screaming, some eerily silent, all moving with the desperate urgency of prey animals fleeing a predator. And scattered throughout the crowd were figures that moved wrong, that pursued the running people with the same mechanical persistence I'd seen in Mrs. Chen. I thought Mrs. Chen was an isolated incident, some kind of medical emergency or psychotic break that had affected one person in one building. When I looked out at Montgomery Street and saw dozens of similar figures shambling through the chaos, I realized that whatever was happening was far bigger than anything I could have imagined. But I still had my bike, and I still had my knowledge of every shortcut and escape route in the city. While everyone else was trapped in cars or buildings, I had mobility and options. I just had to get outside and start pedaling, and I could outrun whatever was pursuing the other people on the street. I grabbed my bike from the rack outside the building and started pedaling toward home, but the streets were clogged with abandoned vehicles and panicked crowds. That's when my years of messenger training became the difference between life and death. While everyone else was trying to use the main arteries that were now completely blocked, I knew alternate routes that could get me across the city without ever touching a major street. I cut through the alley behind the Wells Fargo building, then took the bike lane on Market Street that most people didn't even know existed. My radio was crackling with emergency broadcasts, fragmentary reports about contaminated water supplies, people getting sick, authorities recommending that everyone stay indoors. But I could see that their recommendations were already too late. Whatever had infected Mrs. Chen was spreading faster than any official response could contain. As I pedaled through the city that had been my home for 28 years, I realized that the San Francisco I'd known was disappearing with every passing minute. The shortcuts and secret routes that had made me El Fantasma were about to become the highways through hell, and my reputation as the fastest messenger in the city was about to be tested in ways I'd never imagined. By the time I made it to the lobby of the Morrison and Associates building, my hands were shaking from adrenaline, and my mind was racing to process what I'd just witnessed. Mrs. Chen, who had greeted me with the same professional smile every morning for 3 years, had been feeding on another human being like some kind of wild animal. The image of her clouded white eyes and blood-stained mouth was burned into my memory, but I still couldn't accept what I'd seen as reality. I pushed through the glass doors of the building and stepped onto Montgomery Street, expecting to find the normal Tuesday morning routine of commuters and delivery trucks. Instead, I walked into a scene that looked like it had been pulled from the worst nightmare I'd ever had. The street was filled with abandoned cars, their doors hanging open and engines still running. Coffee cups and briefcases were scattered across the sidewalk, dropped by people who had been going about their morning routines just minutes earlier. But it was the people themselves that made my stomach drop. Some were running, screaming as they fled down the street with the wild-eyed panic of animals being hunted. Others were standing perfectly still, swaying slightly as if they were listening to music that only they could hear. And then there were the ones who moved like Mrs. Chen, with that jerky, unnatural gait that suggested they were no longer entirely in control of their own bodies. I watched a San Francisco Police Department officer trying to subdue what appeared to be a businessman in an expensive suit. The cop was using all the standard de-escalation techniques they teach at the academy, speaking in calm, measured tones while keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. He was still thinking like the old world, treating this as a standard mental health crisis that could be resolved with patience and proper procedure. The businessman turned toward the officer with the same mechanical movement I'd seen from Mrs. Chen. His tie was askew, and his white shirt was stained with something dark, but his face was what made me take an involuntary step backward. His eyes had the same milky opacity, and when he opened his mouth, I could see that his teeth were stained with blood. The officer was still talking, still trying to calm the situation, when the businessman lunged forward with speed that seemed impossible for someone who had been moving so clumsily just seconds before. What happened next taught me the first rule of survival in this new world. The old rules no longer applied. The officer went down, and within seconds, his radio was broadcasting calls for backup that would never come. I realized that anyone who tried to handle these infected people with conventional methods was going to end up like that cop, and probably worse. I unlocked my bike from the rack outside the building, my fingers fumbling with the combination lock as I tried to process the chaos unfolding around me. My messenger bag felt heavier than usual, weighted down not just with my normal supplies, but with the growing realization that everything I'd prepared for my regular workday was now completely inadequate for whatever this situation had become. The radio clipped to my bag strap was crackling with increasingly frantic communications. Emergency dispatchers were reporting incidents at multiple hospitals throughout the city, with references to patients becoming violent and attacking medical staff. Water department facilities were going offline one by one, with maintenance crews reporting strange odors and discoloration in the supply lines. The fragmentary reports were painting a picture of citywide crisis that was spreading faster than any coordinated response could handle. I started pedaling toward home, but the normal routes I would have taken were completely blocked. Market Street, which usually flowed with organized traffic even during rush hour, looked like a parking lot filled with abandoned vehicles. Drivers had simply gotten out of their cars and walked away, leaving entire lanes blocked by empty sedans and delivery trucks with their engines still running. But this is where my years of experience as both a professional messenger and underground racer gave me an advantage that most people didn't have. While everyone else was trying to navigate using the main arterial streets that were now completely impassable, I knew alternate routes that could get me across the city without ever touching a major thoroughfare. Every alley, every loading dock, every shortcut that I'd used to shave seconds off my delivery times was now a potential escape route through the chaos. I turned off Montgomery Street and cut through the narrow alley that ran behind the Wells Fargo building. It was a route I'd used hundreds of times before, usually to avoid the heavy pedestrian traffic that clogged the sidewalks during lunch hour. The alley was barely wide enough for a delivery truck, lined with dumpsters and loading docks that serviced the office buildings on either side. As I pedaled through the dim space between the buildings, I started to notice details that hadn't been visible from the main street. Windows on the upper floors showed signs of struggle, furniture overturned, papers scattered, and in some cases, dark stains on the glass that I didn't want to think about too carefully. The normal sounds of office life, phones ringing, printers running, people having conversations, had been replaced by an eerie silence broken only by occasional screams from the streets beyond. I emerged from the alley onto Market Street, where the bike lane that most drivers didn't even know existed gave me a clear path through the gridlock. Market Street was one of the main arteries of San Francisco, a broad avenue that connected the financial district to the residential neighborhoods where most of the city's workforce lived. Under normal circumstances, it would have been packed with commuter traffic at this time of morning. Instead, it looked like a battlefield. Cars were scattered at random angles across multiple lanes, some with their hoods up and steam rising from overheated engines, others simply abandoned with their doors open and personal belongings scattered on the asphalt. I could see people moving between the vehicles, but their movements had that same unnatural quality I'd observed in Mrs. Chen and the businessman who had attacked the police officer. My radio continued to broadcast fragmentary emergency communications, but the reports were becoming more disjointed and desperate. Dispatch centers were losing contact with field units. Hospitals were reporting that they could no longer accept new patients, and there were repeated references to water supply contamination that suggested the source of whatever was happening was far more widespread than a localized outbreak. As I pedaled through the bike lane, staying as far as possible from the abandoned cars and the figures moving between them, I started to piece together a timeline of events. The initial reports had mentioned incidents at water treatment facilities, and the symptoms I was observing, the clouded eyes, the aggressive behavior, the apparent loss of normal human cognitive function, suggested some kind of chemical or biological contamination that was affecting the central nervous system. But the speed of the spread was what really terrified me. I'd left my apartment less than 2 hours earlier, and at that time the city had seemed normal except for an unusual number of sirens. Now, entire city blocks were in chaos, with what appeared to be a significant percentage of the population affected by whatever had contaminated the water supply. I passed a group of people who were trying to break into a pharmacy, but their movements were slow and uncoordinated, as if they were operating their bodies by remote control. One of them turned toward me as I rode past, and I got a clear look at her face. She had been a young professional, probably heading to work at one of the startup companies in Soma, but now her business attire was torn and stained, and her eyes had that same milky opacity I was starting to recognize as a sign of infection. She tried to follow me, but her movements were clumsy and she stumbled over her own feet. That gave me hope. If these infected people were slow and uncoordinated, then my bike and my knowledge of the city's street layout would be enough to keep me safe until whatever government response was being organized could get the situation under control. But even as I had that thought, I was observing details that suggested the situation was far more serious than I wanted to admit. The infected people I'd seen so far were moving slowly, but they were also showing signs of coordination that didn't fit with my assumption that they were simply suffering from some kind of chemical poisoning. They seemed to be aware of each other, and in some cases, they appeared to be moving in the same direction with a sense of purpose that suggested they retained some level of cognitive function. I continued pedaling toward the Mission District, using a combination of bike lanes, alleys, and side streets that formed a route I'd developed over years of racing and professional deliveries. The path took me through neighborhoods that were still relatively quiet, but I could see signs of the spreading chaos even in areas that hadn't yet been directly affected. Store owners were pulling down security gates and locking their doors, even though it was still morning and they should have been opening for business. People were walking quickly with their heads down, avoiding eye contact and staying close to buildings, as if they were trying to make themselves as small and invisible as possible. The normal rhythm of city life, the casual interactions between strangers, the relaxed pace of people who felt safe in their environment, had been replaced by the hypervigilant behavior of people who sensed danger but couldn't identify its source. My radio picked up a transmission from the San Francisco Fire Department reporting a structure fire in the Richmond district. But when they requested backup, the response was that all available units were already committed to other emergencies. That was unprecedented. The SFFD prided itself on rapid response times and comprehensive coverage, but they were apparently being overwhelmed by the sheer number of simultaneous incidents occurring throughout the city. As I got closer to home, I started to see more direct evidence of whatever was spreading through the population. A city bus was stopped in the middle of 16th Street, its doors open and passengers scattered around it in various states of distress. The bus driver was slumped over the steering wheel, but I could see movement in his shoulders that suggested he was still alive, though whether he was still human was another question entirely. I detoured around the bus using a route that took me through Dollars Park, where the normal morning joggers and dog walkers had been replaced by small groups of people who were clearly trying to figure out what was happening. Some had portable radios and were huddled around them, listening to increasingly apocalyptic news reports. Others were on their phones, apparently trying to contact family members or emergency services with little success. The park gave me a vantage point to observe the broader pattern of whatever was happening throughout the city. I could see smoke rising from multiple locations, suggesting that the structure fires weren't limited to the Richmond district. Traffic had essentially stopped moving on all the major arteries I could see, and there were clusters of people gathering at key intersections, though whether they were trying to help each other or simply seeking safety in numbers wasn't clear from my distance. What was clear was that whatever response the city government and emergency services were mounting, it wasn't keeping pace with the spread of whatever was causing people to behave like Mrs. Chen. The normal systems that San Francisco residents relied on for safety and security were being overwhelmed by the sheer scope and speed of the crisis. I continued toward the Mission District, taking streets that I knew would be less crowded and easier to navigate. But as I got closer to my neighborhood, I started to encounter more infected individuals, and their behavior was beginning to change in ways that made me reconsider my assumptions about their capabilities. The first thing I noticed was that they were moving faster than the ones I'd seen earlier. The businessman who had attacked the police officer had been clumsy and uncoordinated, but the infected people I was seeing now seemed to have adapted to their condition. They still had the clouded eyes and the unnatural movements, but they were navigating obstacles and pursuing targets with increasing efficiency. The second thing I noticed was that they seemed to be learning from each other. When one of them discovered a way to open a door or climb over a barrier, the others in the immediate area would adopt the same technique. It was like watching a distributed intelligence network operating through multiple bodies, sharing information and adapting strategies in real time. I watched a group of 3 infected people working together to break into a corner grocery store. One of them had figured out how to use a loose brick as a tool to break the window, and the other 2 immediately began using similar objects in the same way. Their movements were still jerky and unnatural, but they were problem-solving in a way that suggested they retained more cognitive function than I had initially assumed. That realization changed my assessment of the threat level significantly. If these infected people were capable of learning and adapting, then the advantage I thought I had with my bike and my knowledge of the city's layout might not be as decisive as I had hoped. They might be slow now, but if they continued to adapt and improve their coordination, they could become much more dangerous very quickly. I reached the Mission District and turned onto 24th Street, where I'd lived for the past 5 years. The neighborhood looked different from how I'd left it just a few hours earlier, but the changes were subtle and probably wouldn't have been noticeable to someone who didn't know the area intimately. Windows that were usually open were closed and covered with curtains or blinds. The small businesses that lined the street, the taquerias, the vintage clothing stores, the coffee shops that catered to the tech workers who were rapidly gentrifying the area, were closed despite the fact that it was now mid-morning on a weekday. The people I saw on the street were moving with purpose and vigilance, staying close to buildings and avoiding the center of the roadway. They weren't panicking, but they were clearly aware that something was wrong, even if they didn't understand the full scope of what was happening throughout the city. I turned onto my block and immediately saw that my apartment building's front door was damaged. The heavy wooden door that had provided security for the building's 12 units was hanging at an odd angle, with one of its hinges torn completely away from the frame. The glass panel that had allowed residents to see who was requesting entry was shattered, and there were dark stains on the door frame that I recognized from my experience at the Morrison and Associates building. As I approached the building, I could hear sounds coming from the stairwells above, not the normal sounds of residents going about their daily routines, but something that sounded like a combination of moaning and scratching, as if someone was trying to claw their way through a wooden door. The sounds were coming from multiple floors, which suggested that whatever had happened in my building had affected more than one resident. I had two choices. I could try to get to my fourth-floor apartment and gather more supplies, risking an encounter with whatever had damaged the front door and was now making those disturbing sounds in the stairwells. Or I could cut my losses, retrieve the emergency supplies I kept in the building's basement storage area, and get out of the neighborhood before the situation deteriorated further. My messenger training and racing experience had taught me to make quick decisions based on incomplete information, and every instinct I had was telling me that trying to reach my apartment would be a fatal mistake. The sounds from the stairwells were getting louder and more agitated, as if whatever was making them was becoming aware of my presence outside the building. I decided to try for the basement storage area, which had a separate entrance that accessed the building's utility areas without requiring me to go through the main lobby or stairwells. It was a risk, but it was a calculated risk that would give me access to supplies that could make the difference between survival and becoming another casualty of whatever was spreading through San Francisco. The basement entrance was located in a narrow alley that ran along the side of the building. It was secured with a heavy padlock that I'd always assumed was designed to keep out casual burglars, but as I approached it, I realized it might also serve to keep something in. The sounds from the main building were muffled but still audible, and they seemed to be concentrated in the areas directly above the basement. I used my multi-tool to work on the padlock, applying techniques I'd learned from other messengers who had to retrieve packages from locked loading docks and security areas. The lock was old and corroded, and after several minutes of careful manipulation, I was able to get it open without making enough noise to attract attention from whatever was in the building above. The basement storage area was dark and smelled like mold and old concrete, but it was also blessedly quiet. I used the flashlight app on my phone to navigate to my storage unit, a wire cage that contained the extra supplies I'd accumulated over years of paranoid preparation. The emergency cache I'd stashed was still there, along with non-perishable food, basic tools, and a few changes of clothes that I kept in case I ever needed to disappear quickly. As I loaded my messenger bag with supplies, I could hear the sounds from upstairs getting more intense. There was definitely something moving in the main part of the building, something that was becoming increasingly agitated. I had the distinct impression that whatever was up there was trying to figure out how to get down to where I was, and I didn't want to find out if it would succeed. I grabbed everything I could carry and headed back toward the alley entrance, moving as quietly as possible. But as I reached the door, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of my neighbor Mr. Rodriguez's voice coming from somewhere above me. I'd known Miguel Rodriguez for 3 years, ever since I'd moved into the building. He was a retired mechanic who reminded me of my father, and we'd often talked about cars and bikes when we ran into each other in the lobby. But the voice I was hearing wasn't really Miguel's voice anymore. It had the same basic tone and inflection, but the words were wrong, distorted in a way that made them sound hungry rather than human. He was calling my name, but he was pronouncing it in a way that suggested he was tasting it rather than simply speaking it. I realized that whatever had infected Mrs. Chen and the other people I'd seen throughout the city had also reached my building, and it had taken my neighbor. The Miguel Rodriguez I'd known was gone, replaced by something that wore his face and spoke with his voice but had entirely different motivations and appetites. I got out of the basement as quickly and quietly as possible, locked the door behind me, and retrieved my bike from where I'd hidden it in the alley. As I started pedaling away from my building, I could hear sounds coming from the upper floors that suggested other residents had been affected as well. The building that had been my home for 5 years was now just another location that I needed to avoid if I wanted to stay alive. Behind me, something that used to be human crashed through my fourth-floor apartment window, sending glass cascading onto the sidewalk below. I didn't look back to see what it was, but I knew that whatever life I'd built in San Francisco was over. There was no going back to my apartment, no returning to my job at Morrison and Associates, no more underground racing through the city streets for the simple thrill of being faster than everyone else. Now I was racing for my life, and the stakes were higher than anything I'd ever faced before. But I still had my bike. I still had my knowledge of every shortcut and escape route in the city, and I still had the supplies I'd accumulated through years of paranoid preparation. Most importantly, I was starting to understand the rules of this new world, and I was learning how to navigate through chaos that would have paralyzed most people. As I pedaled away from my former home, I realized that everything I'd learned as El Phantasma, every technique for moving fast and invisible through urban terrain, every instinct for reading dangerous situations and finding escape routes, was about to be tested in ways I'd never imagined. The underground racing circuit had been preparation for something I never could have anticipated, and now my life depended on being better at it than I'd ever been before. As I pedaled away from my destroyed apartment building, I had nowhere to go and no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between myself and whatever had taken over the place I'd called home for 5 years. The sounds of breaking glass and inhuman voices were fading behind me, but I knew that finding another safe place to spend the night was going to be a challenge unlike anything I'd faced before. My first instinct was to head toward Golden Gate Park, thinking that the open space might be safer than the dense urban environment where the infection seemed to be spreading most rapidly. But as I made my way through the Mission District, I realized that the situation was deteriorating much faster than I had anticipated. What had started as isolated incidents that morning was now affecting entire city blocks. I passed an elementary school where children should have been starting their day, but the playground was empty and the building was dark. A handwritten sign taped to the front gate read, "School closed due to emergency. All students go home immediately." But I could see small faces pressed against classroom windows, and I realized that not all the children had made it home before whatever was happening had reached their school. The sight of those frightened kids looking out at the chaos in the streets hit me harder than anything else I'd witnessed that day. Adults could at least try to understand what was happening, even if they couldn't do anything about it. But those children were trapped in a situation that was beyond their ability to comprehend, dependent on adults who might no longer be capable of protecting them. I thought about stopping to help, but I had no idea how to get into the building safely, and I couldn't be sure that the adults inside were still uninfected. The hard truth was that I was barely managing to keep myself alive, and taking on responsibility for others would probably get us all killed. It was a lesson I was going to have to learn over and over again in the days ahead. In this new world, good intentions could be just as deadly as carelessness. As I continued toward the park, I started to notice that the infected people were behaving differently than they had earlier in the day. The ones I'd seen at the Morrison building and on Montgomery Street had been slow and uncoordinated, moving almost like sleepwalkers. But the infected individuals I was encountering now seemed more alert and purposeful. They were still obviously not normal, with those clouded eyes and jerky movements, but they were navigating obstacles more efficiently and responding to stimuli more quickly. I watched one of them figure out how to open a car door by pulling on the handle rather than just clawing at the window. Once it succeeded, two other infected people nearby immediately adopted the same technique. It was like watching a software update propagate through a network. Each individual learned something new, and that knowledge was somehow shared with others in the area. That observation changed my assessment of the threat in fundamental ways. If these infected people were capable of learning and adapting, then the strategies that were working for me now might not continue to work for much longer. My advantage was based on being faster and smarter than slow, mindless opponents. But if they were getting smarter too, I was going to need to stay several steps ahead of their learning curve. By the time I reached the edge of Golden Gate Park, It was early afternoon, and I was exhausted from hours of constant vigilance and physical exertion. I needed food, water, and rest, but I also needed to find a place where I could think through what I'd learned and figure out what to do next. The park seemed like it might offer both safety and solitude, away from the urban environment where the infection was spreading most rapidly. But as I entered the park through the Haight Street entrance, I realized that I wasn't the only person who'd had the idea of seeking refuge in open space. There were clusters of people scattered throughout the meadows and around the lake, some sitting quietly by themselves, others gathered in small groups around portable radios or smartphones, trying to get information about what was happening in the rest of the city. Most of these people looked like refugees from the chaos I'd been riding through all morning. They had the shell-shocked expressions of people who'd witnessed things that didn't fit into their normal understanding of reality. Some were clutching personal belongings they'd grabbed while fleeing their homes or offices. Others sat empty-handed, staring into space as if they were still trying to process what they'd experienced. I approached one of the groups that was clustered around a battery-powered radio, hoping to get more complete information about the scope of the crisis. The radio was tuned to a local news station, but the broadcasts were fragmentary and contradictory. Reports of violence and chaos were coming in from throughout the Bay Area, but the authorities seemed to have no clear understanding of what was causing the incidents or how to respond to them. The group around the radio included a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Martinez. She'd been working the night shift at UCSF Medical Center when the first infected patients started arriving, and her account of what she'd witnessed there filled in some of the gaps in my understanding of how the crisis had developed. According to Dr. Martinez, the first cases had started showing up in emergency rooms around 4 o'clock that morning, about 3 hours before I'd encountered Mrs. Chen at the law office. The initial symptoms had been similar to severe food poisoning, nausea, disorientation, and aggressive behavior that the medical staff had attributed to delirium caused by dehydration. But within hours, the patients had deteriorated rapidly, developing the clouded eyes and violent tendencies that I'd observed throughout the city. More disturbing, they'd begun attacking other patients and medical staff with a ferocity that seemed to have no connection to their previous personalities or mental states. Dr. Martinez had realized that whatever was causing the symptoms was spreading rapidly and wasn't responding to any conventional medical treatments. When she tried to report her observations to the Centers for Disease Control, she'd been told that similar reports were coming in from hospitals throughout California, and that the federal response was already being overwhelmed by the scope of the outbreak. She'd left the hospital when it became clear that the building was no longer safe for either patients or staff, and she'd been trying to reach family members in other parts of the state ever since. But communication systems were failing as the crisis spread, and she had no way of knowing whether her relatives were safe or even still alive. Another member of the group was a man named Tony Castellanos, who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine before returning to San Francisco to work in private security. His military experience gave him a different perspective on what we were facing, and his assessment of the situation was grimmer than anything I'd considered. According to Tony, the speed and scope of the outbreak suggested that it wasn't a natural phenomenon but something that had been deliberately introduced into the water supply. The coordinated timing of incidents throughout the Bay Area, combined with the specific targeting of water treatment facilities, indicated a level of planning and execution that went beyond anything a terrorist cell could have accomplished without significant resources and inside knowledge. But whether the outbreak was natural or artificial, Tony's conclusion was the same. The normal systems of government and emergency response were going to collapse within days if they hadn't collapsed already. We were on our own, and our survival was going to depend on our ability to adapt to a world where the basic assumptions of civilized society no longer applied. The third person in our group was a teenager named Marcus, who'd been separated from his family when his high school had been evacuated that morning. He was still hoping that his parents would find him, but as the afternoon wore on and no official rescue efforts materialized, it was becoming clear that he was going to have to learn to take care of himself. As we shared information and tried to piece together a complete picture of what was happening, I started to realize that my skills as a messenger and underground racer gave me capabilities that none of the others possessed. I could move quickly and quietly through the city, navigate areas that were too dangerous for people on foot or in vehicles, and I had knowledge of routes and resources that could be valuable for gathering information or supplies. But more than that, I was starting to understand that communication was going to be one of the most critical needs in this new world. The normal methods of staying in touch, cell phones, internet, radio broadcasts were failing as the infrastructure was damaged or abandoned. People were becoming isolated from each other, cut off from information about what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. Dr. Martinez mentioned that there were other groups of survivors scattered throughout the park, and that some had established temporary camps in more remote areas where they felt safer from both the infected and the breakdown of civil order that was occurring in the more populated parts of the city. If I could establish contact between these groups, I could create a network that would benefit everyone involved. That afternoon, I made my first supply run as a messenger in the post-outbreak world. Dr. Martinez needed medical supplies from a pharmacy in the Sunset District, and Tony wanted to check on a friend who worked at a gun store in the Richmond. Marcus was hoping I could find out whether his family's house in the Castro was still safe. I loaded my messenger bag with water and energy bars, checked my bike to make sure it was ready for extended travel through potentially dangerous terrain, and set out to explore the new geography of survival that San Francisco had become. What I found was a city that was transforming rapidly as different neighborhoods adapted to the crisis in different ways. Some areas had organized quickly, with residents working together to establish barricades and security patrols. Others had descended into chaos, with looting and violence adding to the dangers posed by the infected. The most disturbing areas were the ones that seemed completely abandoned, where entire blocks were silent except for the occasional sounds of breaking glass or inhuman moaning from inside buildings. The pharmacy Dr. Martinez had mentioned was in one of the organized neighborhoods, where residents had barricaded the main streets but left the alleys open for people who knew how to navigate them safely. I was able to get most of the medical supplies she'd requested, trading some of my emergency cash for antibiotics and pain medications that were going to be impossible to replace once the existing stocks were exhausted. The gun store in the Richmond was a different story. The neighborhood around it had been hit hard by the outbreak, and the streets were littered with abandoned cars and evidence of violence. I found the store, but it had been broken into and cleaned out hours earlier. Tony's friend was nowhere to be found, and the blood stains on the walls suggested that he hadn't survived the encounter with whoever had looted his inventory. Marcus's family house in the Castro was still standing, but it was clear that no one had been there for hours. The front door was open, and personal belongings were scattered across the yard as if the residents had left in a hurry. I left a note explaining where Marcus could be found, but I doubted that his parents would ever return to read it. As I made my way back to Golden Gate Park, I started to understand the pattern of how the outbreak was affecting different parts of the city. Areas with strong community organizations and residents who knew each other well were able to coordinate defensive measures and maintain some semblance of order. Neighborhoods where people were more isolated or transient were falling apart rapidly, becoming dangerous for anyone who wasn't infected. But I also noticed that the infected were beginning to show more sophisticated behavior patterns. They were avoiding the organized neighborhoods where resistance was strong, and concentrating in areas where they could find easy targets. It was like watching a predator species adapt its hunting strategies based on the defensive behaviors of its prey. When I returned to the park that evening, I found that our small group had grown. Word had spread about Dr. Martinez's medical knowledge and Tony's security expertise, and other survivors had sought them out for help and guidance. What had started as 4 people sharing information around a radio had become the nucleus of a community that was trying to figure out how to survive in a world that had changed beyond recognition. But with growth came new challenges. We needed more food, clean water, shelter materials, and medical supplies. We needed information about which parts of the city were safe to travel through and which should be avoided. Most importantly, we needed communication with other survivor groups so we could coordinate our efforts and avoid working at cross purposes. That's when I realized that my role in this new world wasn't going to be just as another survivor trying to stay alive. My skills as a messenger, my knowledge of the city's hidden routes, and my ability to move quickly through dangerous territory made me uniquely valuable as a link between isolated groups of people who were all facing the same challenges. I spent that first night in the park listening to the stories of people who'd lost everything they'd built over years or decades, reduced to refugees in their own city by an outbreak that no one fully understood. But I also listened to people making plans, figuring out how to adapt their skills to new challenges, and organizing themselves into something that might be able to survive and eventually thrive. Dr. Martinez was already treating injured survivors with improvised medical equipment. Tony was teaching basic security measures to people who'd never had to think about physical defense before. Marcus was helping to organize the distribution of food and water to make sure that everyone got at least minimal nutrition. And I was beginning to understand that my contribution was going to be movement, the ability to connect these isolated pockets of humanity and create a communication network that could coordinate resistance against both the infected and the breakdown of civilization itself. As I lay on the ground that night, using my messenger bag as a pillow and listening to the distant sounds of a city in chaos, I thought about how much my life had changed in less than 24 hours. That morning, I'd been El Phantasma, racing through the streets for the thrill of being faster than everyone else. Now I was just Jax, one of the last functioning messengers in a city where communication might be the difference between survival and extinction. But I still had my bike. I still knew every shortcut and hidden route in San Francisco. And I was starting to develop new skills that were specifically adapted to navigating through a world where the streets were controlled by things that used to be human. The underground racing circuit had taught me to read terrain and find the fastest line through obstacles. Now, I was learning to read the behavior patterns of infected humans and find safe passages through territory they controlled. The radio continued to broadcast fragmentary reports throughout the night, but the information was becoming less reliable as communication systems failed and emergency services were overwhelmed. By dawn, it was clear that we weren't going to be rescued by outside authorities. Whatever response was being organized at the state or federal level, it wasn't going to reach us in time to make a difference. We were on our own, but we weren't alone. Throughout the park and scattered across the city, there were other groups of survivors who were facing the same challenges and making the same difficult transitions from the old world to whatever was coming next. My job was going to be finding them, connecting them, and helping to build something that could survive in a landscape where the rules of civilization had been replaced by the much older and more fundamental rules of predator and prey. That morning, I ate a protein bar from my emergency supplies, checked my bike chain and tire pressure, and prepared to make my first official delivery as a messenger in the post-outbreak world. Dr. Martinez had made contact with a group of survivors who'd taken shelter at the California Academy of Sciences, and they needed medical consultation for several injured people. Tony had heard radio chatter suggesting that there might be organized resistance forming in the Presidio, and he wanted to know if they could coordinate defensive strategies. As I loaded my messenger bag and prepared to leave the relative safety of our camp, I realized that I was about to test everything I'd learned about survival in this new world. The infected were getting smarter and more coordinated. The city was becoming more dangerous, and the margin for error was shrinking with every passing hour. But I'd been preparing for challenges like this my entire life, even though I'd never imagined what form they would take. Every underground race through dangerous territory, every emergency delivery through chaotic traffic, every night I'd spent learning the hidden geography of San Francisco had been training for this moment. I was no longer just a bike messenger carrying legal documents between law offices. I was becoming something new, a communication link between isolated communities of survivors, a scout who could gather intelligence about threats and opportunities, and a vital component of whatever network of resistance was going to emerge from the ruins of the old world. As I prepared to leave Golden Gate Park that second morning, I had no idea that I was about to discover something that would change my understanding of what we were really facing. Dr. Martinez had given me a list of medical supplies she needed, and Tony had asked me to scout potential routes to the Presidio, where he'd heard there might be organized military resistance. But it was Marcus who made the request that would lead me into the most dangerous situation I'd encountered yet. He'd remembered that his uncle worked at the Oceanside water treatment plant, one of the facilities that had gone offline during the first day of the outbreak. Marcus was hoping I could find out what had happened there, partly because he was worried about his uncle, but mostly because Dr. Martinez had a theory that understanding the source of the contamination might help us figure out how to treat the infected. The water treatment plant was located in a part of the city that I'd never had reason to visit as a messenger. It was industrial territory, full of utility buildings and maintenance facilities that were usually staffed by city workers who lived in other neighborhoods. But my racing experience had taught me that every part of the city was connected by routes that most people never noticed, and I was confident I could find my way there without using the main roads that were likely to be crawling with infected. I left the park before dawn, when the infected seemed to be less active, and the streets were easier to navigate safely. My messenger bag was loaded with water, energy bars, basic tools, and the medical supplies I hoped to trade for information or access to areas that would normally be off-limits to civilians. I'd also started carrying a heavy-duty bike lock that could serve as a weapon if I found myself cornered with no escape route. The ride to the Oceanside district took me through neighborhoods that were showing different stages of adaptation to the new reality. Some areas had organized quickly, with residents working together to clear the streets of abandoned vehicles and establish security checkpoints. Others seemed to be in various stages of breakdown, with evidence of looting and violence becoming more common the farther I got from the organized communities. But it was the completely silent neighborhoods that bothered me the most. These were areas where every house was dark, every business was closed, and the only movement came from the occasional infected individual wandering aimlessly through streets that had been completely abandoned by their original inhabitants. These silent zones felt like previews of what the entire city might become, if we couldn't figure out how to stop the spread of whatever was turning people into those mindless, hungry things. As I got closer to the water treatment facility, I started to notice that the infected in this area were behaving differently from the ones I'd observed in other parts of the city. They seemed more organized, moving in small groups that appeared to have some kind of coordination or shared purpose. Instead of wandering randomly, they were concentrated around specific buildings and infrastructure points, as if they were guarding something important. The water treatment plant itself was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, designed to keep out casual trespassers, but not the kind of determined intrusion I was planning. I found a section where the fence had been damaged, apparently by someone trying to break out rather than break in, and I was able to slip through without making enough noise to attract attention from the infected I could see moving around the facility buildings. The first thing I noticed inside the fence was the smell. It was organic and wrong, like the scent of meat that had been left out in the sun for too long, but with a chemical undertone that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. The smell was strongest near the main treatment building, where large pipes carried water from the processing facilities to the distribution system that served the western part of San Francisco. As I moved closer to the buildings, I could see that something catastrophic had happened here. Equipment that should have been running was shut down, and there were dark stains on the concrete walkways that I didn't want to examine too closely. Several of the facility's vehicles were still parked in the employee lot, but their doors were open, and their interiors were splattered with the same dark stains I was seeing throughout the complex. I found Marcus's uncle in the main control room, or at least I found what was left of him. Robert Martinez had been a water treatment supervisor for 15 years, according to the identification badge that was still clipped to his torn and blood-stained work shirt. But the thing that had been Robert Martinez was no longer interested in maintaining the city's water supply. It was crouched in a corner of the control room, making the same low moaning sound I'd heard from infected individuals throughout the city. When it sensed my presence, it looked up with those same clouded white eyes I was learning to recognize as a sign of complete infection. But there was something different about this one, something that made me take an involuntary step backward. The infected people I'd encountered before had seemed to operate on basic impulses: hunger, aggression, the need to pursue anything that moved. But this one seemed to be studying me, evaluating me in a way that suggested it retained more cognitive function than the others. I didn't wait to find out what conclusions it reached. I backed out of the control room as quietly as possible and made my way toward the main treatment area, where I hoped to find clues about what had caused the contamination that was turning people into these things. But as I moved through the facility, I became aware that I wasn't alone. There were other infected individuals moving through the buildings, and they seemed to be responding to some kind of signal or coordination that I couldn't detect. The main treatment building contained the pumps and filtration systems that processed raw water from the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir before distributing it to homes and businesses throughout the city. Under normal circumstances, it would have been staffed by technicians who monitored the equipment and tested the water quality to ensure it met safety standards. But the control panels were dark, the pumps were silent, and the testing equipment had been smashed as if someone had deliberately tried to disable the facility's ability to monitor what was being added to the water supply. That's when I found the first evidence that this wasn't a natural outbreak. Hidden behind one of the main filtration units was equipment that definitely didn't belong in a water treatment facility. It was sophisticated chemical processing gear, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in a research laboratory or pharmaceutical manufacturing plant. And it was still running, powered by an independent generator that was pumping some kind of liquid additive directly into the main water distribution line. I didn't have the expertise to identify what chemical was being added to the water supply, but I could see that it was being introduced in carefully measured doses, suggesting that someone with significant technical knowledge had installed this equipment and programmed it to contaminate the city's water with precision timing. This wasn't a terrorist attack using crude methods. It was a sophisticated operation that required insider access and detailed knowledge of San Francisco's water distribution system. As I was examining the equipment, trying to figure out how to shut it down or at least gather information that Dr. Martinez might be able to use, I heard sounds that indicated I was about to have company. The infected individuals I'd seen moving through the facility were converging on the treatment building, and their movements had the coordinated quality that suggested they were responding to some kind of shared awareness that an intruder was present. I looked for escape routes and realized that I'd made a tactical error by going so deep into the building complex without maintaining clear sight lines to my exit path. The infected were moving to block the main entrances, and I was going to have to find an alternative way out if I wanted to avoid a confrontation that I probably couldn't win. That's when I discovered something that changed my understanding of what these infected people were capable of. As I watched them coordinate their movements to trap me in the building, I realized that they weren't just acting on instinct or basic predatory behavior. They were implementing a strategy that required planning, communication, and the ability to anticipate my likely responses to their actions. The infected individual that had been Robert Martinez appeared in the doorway of the treatment room, and when it saw me, it made a sound that was definitely not random moaning. It was a call, a signal to the others that conveyed specific information about my location and probably my intentions. Within seconds, I could hear other infected individuals responding to the call and adjusting their positions accordingly. I had about 30 seconds before they completed their encirclement, and I needed to find an exit that they hadn't anticipated. The treatment building had been designed with multiple access points for maintenance purposes, including roof hatches that provided access to the filtration equipment. I climbed onto one of the main processing units and found a ladder that led to a service hatch in the ceiling. The roof of the treatment building gave me a vantage point to observe the broader facility and plan my escape route. But what I saw from up there was more disturbing than anything I'd witnessed inside the building. The infected weren't just randomly distributed throughout the water treatment plant. They were organized in patterns that suggested they were actively guarding the facility against interference. There were clusters of them positioned at all the main access points, and others patrolling the perimeter in coordinated groups. It was like looking at a military unit that had been deployed to secure strategic infrastructure, except that the soldiers had been replaced by things that used to be human, but now operated according to entirely different priorities. I also saw something that made me realize how much danger I was in. There were more infected individuals approaching the facility from the surrounding area, apparently drawn by whatever signal had alerted the ones already inside the complex to my presence. If I didn't get out quickly, I was going to find myself trapped in a facility that was becoming more heavily guarded with each passing minute. I used the building's maintenance infrastructure to move across the roof toward the damaged section of perimeter fence where I'd entered the facility. The infected below were tracking my movement, but they seemed to have difficulty coordinating a response to someone who was moving three-dimensionally through an environment they could only navigate at ground level. When I reached the edge of the roof, I had to drop down into the facility yard and sprint for the fence opening while the infected tried to intercept me. It was like the most intense underground race I'd ever participated in, except that finishing second meant becoming the kind of thing I was running from. I made it through the fence with seconds to spare, but as I got back on my bike and started pedaling away from the water treatment plant, I could see infected individuals climbing the fence behind me. They were learning to overcome obstacles that would have stopped them just days earlier, and their problem-solving abilities were improving at a rate that was genuinely terrifying. The ride back toward Golden Gate Park gave me time to process what I discovered at the water treatment facility. The contamination wasn't accidental, and it wasn't the result of some natural biological agent that had somehow gotten into the water supply. Someone had deliberately installed equipment to introduce a chemical agent that was designed to transform the population of San Francisco into those mindless, hungry things that were now threatening everyone who remained uninfected. But even more disturbing was the realization that the infected weren't as mindless as I'd initially assumed. They were developing organizational capabilities and problem-solving skills that suggested they retained significant cognitive function. They were learning to work together, to plan strategies, and to adapt their behavior based on the challenges they encountered. When I returned to our camp in Golden Gate Park, I found that our small community had continued to grow. Dr. Martinez was treating a steady stream of injured survivors. Tony had organized security patrols that were beginning to establish safe corridors between different survivor groups, and Marcus had become something like a coordinator for the distribution of supplies and information. But I also found that we were facing new challenges that hadn't existed just days earlier. Food was becoming scarce, as the normal supply chains that fed the city had broken down completely. Clean water was a constant concern, especially now that I knew the municipal supply was deliberately contaminated. And we were starting to encounter other groups of survivors who weren't interested in cooperation or mutual aid. Some of these groups had decided that the breakdown of civilization meant that the old rules about property and personal safety no longer applied. They were taking what they needed by force, and they saw organized communities like ours as sources of supplies and equipment that could be looted if they could overcome our defenses. Tony had already had to organize our people to repel one such raid, and he was warning everyone that we needed to be prepared for more serious attacks as resources became more scarce and desperate people became more willing to use violence to get what they needed to survive. Dr. Martinez was also dealing with a challenge that was unique to her medical expertise. Some of the survivors we'd taken in were showing early symptoms of infection, apparently from exposure to contaminated water before they'd learned to avoid the municipal supply. She was trying to develop treatments that might slow or reverse the infection process, but her research was hampered by the lack of proper laboratory equipment and the constant pressure of treating trauma injuries and other medical emergencies. My discovery at the water treatment plant had given her some new information to work with, but it had also raised questions that were beyond her ability to answer with the resources available to us. She needed access to laboratory facilities and medical databases that were probably no longer accessible, given the breakdown of communications and the collapse of most institutional infrastructure. That's when I realized that my role as a messenger was going to have to expand beyond just carrying supplies and information between survivor groups. I was going to have to become a scout, gathering intelligence about which facilities might still be functional, which resources might still be accessible, and which areas of the city were safe enough to support the kind of research and development work that might be essential for long-term survival. Over the next week, I made contact with survivor groups throughout San Francisco, creating a communication network that connected communities from the Presidio to the Mission District. Each group had developed different strategies for dealing with the challenges of the new world, and by sharing information about what worked and what didn't, we were able to improve everyone's chances of survival. But I was also learning that the city was becoming more dangerous with each passing day. The infected were continuing to evolve, developing new capabilities and more sophisticated organizational structures. Areas that had been safe to travel through just days earlier were now controlled by coordinated groups of infected that could set traps and execute complex hunting strategies. I had several close calls during supply runs, situations where I barely escaped from infected groups that had obviously planned their attack in advance and anticipated my likely escape routes. My advantage in speed and mobility was becoming less decisive as the infected learned to work together and develop strategies specifically designed to counter the tactics I was using to avoid them. The most disturbing incident occurred during a supply run to a pharmacy in the Richmond district. I'd made the same route several times before without serious problems, but this time I found myself being herded toward a specific location by infected individuals who had positioned themselves to block my alternate escape routes. They had obviously studied my previous runs and identified the shortcuts I relied on to avoid the main streets where they concentrated their forces. When I tried to use an alley that had been safe just 2 days earlier, I found it blocked by a carefully constructed barricade that forced me to turn toward a side street where more infected were waiting. It was like being hunted by an intelligence that could learn from experience and predict my behavior based on patterns I hadn't even realized I was following. I managed to escape by abandoning my planned route entirely and taking risks that I normally would never have considered. But the experience taught me that I was going to have to constantly vary my tactics if I wanted to stay ahead of their learning curve. When I returned to Golden Gate Park that evening, I found our community preparing for a challenge that was going to test everything we'd learned about survival in the New World. Tony had intercepted radio communications, indicating that a large group of raiders was planning to attack our camp, apparently under the assumption that we'd accumulated supplies and equipment that would be worth the effort of taking by force. But we'd also received word that there were survivors at Alcatraz who had discovered something that might be crucial for understanding how to fight the infection. They'd been trying to establish radio contact with survivor groups on the mainland, but their transmissions were being jammed by someone who apparently didn't want that information to reach us. I was going to have to make a choice between staying to help defend our camp against the raiders or attempting the dangerous journey to Alcatraz to find out what the survivors there had discovered. Either decision carried enormous risks, but I was starting to understand that in this new world, the biggest risk was always inaction. The infected were getting smarter, more organized, and more dangerous every day. The breakdown of civilization was creating opportunities for people who were willing to use violence to take what they needed from those who were trying to maintain some semblance of humanity and cooperation. And somewhere out there, whoever had deliberately contaminated the water supply was probably planning the next phase of whatever agenda had motivated them to transform San Francisco into a battleground between the living and the infected. My messenger bag was packed with everything I'd need for the journey to Alcatraz, including waterproof containers for the radio equipment I'd need to establish communication with the survivors there. My bike was equipped with modifications that would allow me to navigate through territory that was increasingly controlled by infected groups that had learned to hunt in coordinated packs. But most importantly, I was carrying information that connected dozens of survivor groups throughout the city, creating a network of resistance that was becoming more organized and effective with each passing day. Whatever I found at Alcatraz, I'd be able to share it with communities that were ready to act on intelligence that might tip the balance in our favor. As I prepared to leave Golden Gate Park for what might be the most dangerous mission I'd attempted yet, I thought about how much had changed since I'd been El Fantasma, racing through the streets for the simple thrill of being faster than everyone else. Now I was racing against time itself, carrying hope between isolated communities of survivors who were depending on me to connect them with resources and information that might mean the difference between extinction and the possibility of rebuilding, something worth preserving from the wreckage of the old world. The decision to attempt the journey to Alcatraz came down to a simple calculation that had nothing to do with heroism and everything to do with survival. Tony's intelligence suggested that the raider attack on our Golden Gate Park camp was going to happen whether I stayed to help defend it or not. But the information that the Alcatraz survivors claimed to have might be the key to understanding how to fight back against whoever had deliberately infected San Francisco's water supply. I left the park before dawn on the 7th day after the outbreak began, carrying radio equipment that Dr. Martinez had cobbled together from salvaged electronics, and a waterproof case that Marcus had found during one of his scavenging runs. The plan was to establish contact with the Alcatraz group, find out what they'd discovered, and get that information back to the survivor network we'd been building throughout the city. But getting to Pier 33, where I hoped to find a boat that could take me to the island, meant crossing territory that had become increasingly dangerous as the infected developed more sophisticated hunting strategies. The route I'd planned took me through the financial district, where the concentration of infected was highest, but where I also knew hidden passages that most people had never discovered. The ride through downtown San Francisco was like traveling through a graveyard that hadn't quite figured out it was dead yet. Office buildings that had housed thousands of workers just a week earlier stood dark and empty, their windows reflecting the morning sun like the eyes of corpses. The streets were littered with abandoned vehicles and personal belongings that people had dropped while fleeing from something they couldn't understand or fight. But it was the infected themselves that provided the most disturbing evidence of how much the situation had deteriorated since my first encounter with Mrs. Chen at the Morrison and Associates building. The slow, uncoordinated movements I'd observed during the early days of the outbreak had been replaced by behavior that was becoming increasingly organized and purposeful. I watched a group of infected working together to break into a corner grocery store, not with the mindless persistence I'd seen before, but with what appeared to be a deliberate strategy. One of them had found a piece of rebar that could be used as a prying tool, and the others had positioned themselves to catch canned goods as they fell from the shelves. They weren't just feeding randomly. They were systematically harvesting resources that could sustain them over time. Even more disturbing was their reaction to my presence. When the group became aware that I was watching them from across the street, they didn't immediately abandon what they were doing to pursue me. Instead, two of them continued working on the store while the other three moved to positions where they could intercept me if I tried to pass through their territory. It was tactical thinking that suggested they were capable of multitasking and long-term planning. I detoured around their position using a route that took me through the loading dock areas behind the office buildings. But I was acutely aware that they were tracking my movement and probably communicating my location to other infected groups in the area. The advantage I'd had in speed and knowledge of hidden routes was being eroded by their growing ability to anticipate my tactics and coordinate their responses. As I got closer to the waterfront, I started to encounter evidence of the larger conflict that was developing between different factions of survivors. Some buildings showed signs of having been fortified by organized groups, with barricades and defensive positions that indicated serious preparation for extended conflict. Others had been burned or bombed, apparently to deny their use to enemy forces. The most troubling discovery was a checkpoint that had been established at the intersection of Market and Embarcadero, manned by survivors who were demanding payment or supplies from anyone who wanted to pass through their territory. They weren't infected, but they also weren't interested in cooperation or mutual aid. They decided that the breakdown of civilization meant that might made right, and they were prepared to use violence to enforce their control over strategic locations. I managed to avoid their checkpoint by using maintenance tunnels that connected the BART system to the waterfront, but the encounter reminded me that the infected weren't our only enemy anymore. Desperate people were making desperate choices, and some of those choices involved preying on other survivors rather than working together against the common threat. Pier 33 was located in an area that had been hit hard during the early days of the outbreak, when tourists and commuters had been trapped in the open with nowhere to hide when the infection began spreading through the crowds. The tourist boats that normally carried visitors to Alcatraz were still moored at the dock, but their crews were long gone, and the vessels showed signs of having been abandoned hastily. I found one boat that appeared to be mechanically sound, a mid-sized charter vessel that was designed for day trips around the bay. The keys were still in the ignition, apparently dropped by a captain who'd had more urgent priorities than securing his boat when the situation started deteriorating. But starting the engine and navigating to Alcatraz was going to require skills I'd never developed as a bike messenger, and I was going to have to learn fast if I wanted to complete this mission. The boat's radio was still functional, and I was able to establish contact with the Alcatraz survivors on a frequency that Dr. Martinez had given me. The voice that responded to my transmission belonged to someone who identified himself as Dr. James Chen, a CDC researcher who'd been visiting the island when the outbreak began and had been stranded there when all ferry service was suspended. According to Dr. Chen, the Alcatraz group included several federal researchers who'd been investigating reports of unusual biological activity in the Bay Area during the weeks leading up to the outbreak. They discovered evidence that the contamination of San Francisco's water supply wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated attack that had targeted multiple cities throughout California and possibly beyond. More importantly, they'd managed to synthesize a compound that appeared to slow the progression of the infection in people who'd been exposed, but hadn't yet developed the full symptoms. It wasn't a cure, but it might buy time for infected individuals to recover their cognitive function enough to resist the behavioral changes that turned them into the mindless, hungry things I'd been dodging throughout the city. But Dr. Chen also warned me that getting to the island was going to be more dangerous than I'd anticipated. The bay waters around Alcatraz were being patrolled by infected individuals who'd apparently learned to operate small boats, and they were actively interfering with any attempts to reach the island. Several survivor groups had already attempted the crossing, and none of them had made it through the infected naval blockade. As I prepared to start the boat engine and attempt the crossing myself, I realized that I was about to test everything I'd learned about survival in this new world against opponents who were continuing to evolve and adapt at a rate that was genuinely terrifying. The infected weren't just getting smarter. They were developing specialized capabilities that suggested they were becoming something entirely different from the humans they'd once been. The engine started on the third try, and I cast off from Pier 33 with the morning fog still hanging low over the bay. The radio chatter from Dr. Chen indicated that the Alcatraz survivors were tracking my approach and would try to provide covering fire if I ran into trouble during the crossing. But I was essentially on my own until I reached the island's protective perimeter. The first sign of trouble came when I was about halfway across the bay and started to see movement in the water around my boat. At first, I thought it might be seals or sea lions, which were common in the bay and might be attracted by the noise of the engine. But as the shapes got closer, I could see that they were human figures who were swimming with coordination and purpose that suggested they weren't simply victims who'd fallen overboard. These infected swimmers were operating in coordinated groups, approaching my boat from multiple directions simultaneously in a pattern that was clearly designed to prevent me from escaping by simply changing course. They were also moving faster than I would have thought possible for people who were supposed to be suffering from the cognitive impairment that characterized the infection. I increased the boat's speed and tried to navigate around the swimmers, but they adjusted their intercept courses with precision that indicated they understood my intentions and were capable of predicting my likely responses. It was like being pursued by a school of predatory fish that had developed the ability to think strategically about hunting techniques. One of the swimmers managed to grab onto the boat's stern and tried to pull himself aboard, giving me my first close look at how the infection had progressed in people who'd been exposed for more than a week. His skin had a grayish pallor that suggested significant physiological changes, and his eyes had not just the clouded appearance I'd seen in early-stage infected, but an entirely different structure that seemed adapted for underwater vision. I managed to dislodge him with a boat hook I found in the vessel's emergency equipment, but the encounter taught me that the infection wasn't just changing people's behavior. It was actually modifying their physical capabilities in ways that made them better adapted to aquatic environments. These weren't just crazy people who jumped into the bay. They were something new, something that had been specifically designed or evolved to operate in marine conditions. The crossing to Alcatraz took nearly an hour, during which I was constantly maneuvering to avoid infected swimmers who seemed to be coordinating their attacks through some kind of communication system I couldn't detect. By the time I reached the island's dock, I was exhausted from the constant vigilance and stress of evading opponents, who were clearly operating according to tactical principles that were beyond anything I'd encountered on land. Dr. Chen met me at the dock with several other survivors who'd taken refuge on Alcatraz when the outbreak began. The group included federal researchers, Park Service employees, and a few tourists who'd been visiting the island when ferry service was suspended. They'd organized themselves into an effective community that was using the island's isolation and defensive advantages to continue research into the nature and origins of the outbreak. The information they'd gathered was more disturbing than anything I'd learned during my week of survival in San Francisco. According to their research, the contamination of urban water supplies had been carried out simultaneously in at least 12 major cities throughout California, using sophisticated chemical agents that had been introduced into water treatment facilities by people with insider knowledge and access. But the goal of the contamination wasn't simply to kill large numbers of people or create chaos that would cripple government response capabilities. The chemical agents were designed to modify human physiology and neurology in specific ways that would create a new type of organism that retained human intelligence while being optimized for survival in post-civilization environments. Dr. Chen showed me laboratory data that indicated the infected weren't just sick people who'd lost their minds. They were humans who were being systematically transformed into something that was better adapted to a world where traditional infrastructure and social organization had collapsed. The process was gradual, with infected individuals becoming more capable and organized as the physiological changes progressed. The swimming infected I'd encountered during the crossing weren't an anomaly. They were examples of how the infection was creating specialized variants that were adapted to specific environmental challenges. There were probably infected individuals who developed enhanced night vision for operating in dark urban environments, others who developed improved climbing abilities for navigating damaged buildings, and possibly even variants that were specialized for different types of combat or resource gathering. But Dr. Chen's most important discovery was that the infection could be slowed or even reversed if treatment was administered within the first 72 hours after exposure. The compound they developed on Alcatraz wasn't a complete cure, but it could prevent the most severe physiological changes and allow infected individuals to retain enough cognitive function to resist the behavioral programming that turned them into hunters. The problem was that producing the compound required access to laboratory equipment and chemical supplies that weren't available on Alcatraz, and distributing it to infected individuals required getting close enough to administer injections to people who were programmed to attack anyone who approached them. It was a treatment that could save lives, but only if we could solve the logistical and tactical challenges of implementing it on a large scale. As I prepared to return to San Francisco with this information, Dr. Chen warned me that the situation on the mainland was probably worse than when I'd left that morning. Radio intercepts suggested that the coordinated raider attacks weren't random acts of desperation, but part of a larger strategy being implemented by organized groups that were taking advantage of the chaos to establish territorial control over key resources and infrastructure. Some of these groups appeared to be working with the infected rather than fighting them, suggesting that there were people who saw the collapse of civilization as an opportunity to build something new according to their own vision of how society should be organized. They were using the infected as a weapon against survivor communities that were trying to maintain democratic organization and mutual aid. The return trip to Pier 33 was even more dangerous than the outbound crossing, partly because the infected swimmers had apparently learned from their earlier failure and developed new tactics for intercepting boats. But I also encountered something that was completely new: infected individuals who were operating watercraft of their own, apparently having learned to pilot small boats with enough skill to coordinate maritime attacks. I managed to reach the mainland by using the boat's speed and maneuverability to stay ahead of the infected pursuit. But the experience taught me that my assumptions about the limitations of infected capabilities were becoming obsolete faster than I could adapt my survival strategies. These weren't mindless zombies that could be avoided by staying out of their reach. They were an organized force that was developing new capabilities, specifically designed to counter the tactics that survivors were using to evade them. When I finally made it back to Golden Gate Park, I found that our community had successfully repelled the raider attack that Tony had anticipated, but at a cost that had changed the fundamental nature of our group. We'd lost several people during the fighting, including Marcus, who'd been killed while trying to protect the medical supplies that Dr. Martinez needed to treat wounded survivors. The raiders had been more organized and better equipped than we'd expected, with military-style weapons and tactical coordination that suggested they'd been planning the attack for days. They'd also shown knowledge of our defensive positions and supply caches that indicated they'd been conducting surveillance on our community for longer than we'd realized. Tony had managed to capture one of the raiders during the fighting, and under questioning, the prisoner had revealed information that connected the raider attacks to the same organization that had contaminated the water supply. The breakdown of civilization wasn't a side effect of the infection. It was part of the plan, designed to create conditions that would allow a small group of people to establish authoritarian control over the survivors. Dr. Martinez was eager to begin synthesizing the compound that Dr. Chen had discovered, but she was also struggling with the ethical implications of deciding who would receive treatment when our production capabilities were limited. The compound could potentially save people who'd been recently infected, but administering it required resources and time that we needed for treating conventional injuries and illnesses. As I shared the intelligence I'd gathered from Alcatraz with the expanded network of survivor communities we'd been building throughout San Francisco, I realized that we were facing a choice that would determine not just our immediate survival, but the kind of society we were going to build from the ruins of the old world. We could focus on pure survival, using our limited resources to keep our own people alive while avoiding risks that might help others. Or we could commit to the more dangerous path of active resistance, trying to develop and distribute treatments that could save infected individuals while also fighting back against the organized forces that were trying to establish authoritarian control over the post-outbreak landscape. The information from Alcatraz had given us tools that could make a difference, but only if we were willing to take risks that could easily get us all killed. The compound that could slow or reverse the infection was useless unless we could get close enough to infected individuals to administer it. The intelligence about the coordinated nature of the outbreak was valuable only if we could act on it before the perpetrators completed whatever larger plan they were implementing. Over the following weeks, I continued my work as a messenger, but my role had expanded far beyond simply carrying supplies and information between survivor groups. I was now coordinating a resistance network that spanned the entire Bay Area, connecting communities that were working together to develop treatments for the infected, gather intelligence about the groups behind the outbreak, and build defensive capabilities that could protect civilians from both infected attacks and raider violence. The daily routine I'd established was grueling but necessary. Each morning, I'd check my equipment and plan routes that would take me to communities that needed supplies or information. I'd spend the day navigating through territory that was increasingly controlled by infected groups that had learned to set traps and coordinate hunting strategies. I'd return each evening with intelligence about threats and opportunities that could affect the survival of everyone in our network. But I was also carrying something more important than supplies or tactical information. I was carrying proof that human beings could still work together, still care about each other, still choose cooperation over competition even when civilization had collapsed around them. Every delivery I made was evidence that the values that had made civilization worth preserving could survive even when the institutions that had protected those values were gone. The infected were getting smarter, more organized, and more dangerous every day. The coordinated night movements I'd noticed during the first week had evolved into sophisticated military-style operations that could overwhelm defensive positions that had seemed secure just days earlier. They were learning to use tools, to plan complex strategies, and to adapt their tactics based on the countermeasures that survivor communities developed to resist them. But we were learning too. The paranoid emergency preparations that had made me stockpile supplies and memorize escape routes were keeping me alive. The racing skills that had earned me the nickname El Fantasma were allowing me to outmaneuver opponents who were faster and stronger than normal humans. The messenger training that had taught me to navigate through chaotic urban environments was enabling me to connect isolated communities and coordinate resistance efforts. My name is Jax Rivera. I'm the last bike messenger in San Francisco, and I've still got deliveries to make. 6 weeks ago, I was racing through these streets for the thrill of being faster than everyone else. Now I'm racing against extinction itself, carrying hope between communities of survivors who are rebuilding humanity from the ground up. Tomorrow morning, I'll clip on my helmet, check my routes, and ride out into the dead city again. Because somewhere out there, people are counting on me to bring them more than just supplies. I bring them proof that we're not alone, that we haven't given up, and that humanity is still worth fighting for. The world ended, but we're still here, and as long as there are people who need to stay connected, I'll keep pedaling through whatever hell this city has become. Yesterday, I found a working ham radio in an abandoned electronics store. There might be other cities out there, other networks of survivors who are facing the same challenges we are. Maybe we're not as alone as we thought. Maybe there are other messengers out there, carrying hope through the ruins of their own cities, proving that the human spirit can survive anything if it refuses to give up. The streets that used to be my playground have become a battlefield, but they're still my streets, and I know them better than anything that's trying to hunt me. Every shortcut I've memorized, every escape route I've practiced, every relationship I've built with the communities I serve, it's all preparation for a war I never saw coming but was somehow born to fight.